Hi all, today I would like to make a reflection on the land holdings in the late Middle Ages and especially go looking at what was the overall organization and frame into which land holding in Europe was in at the time. We're talking about essentially the 14th and 15th centuries. To stress especially the kind of progressive crystallization of the landholding system, and consequently, since it was the base of economy at that time, of the same society, as at least one of the major factors that influenced it during the modern age, and broadly speaking the ancien regime, as long as it lasted. So it starts from obvious considerations that we have already discussed in other videos, relatively to the fact that especially from the mid of the 14th century, there is a great increase of the concentration of properties into the hands of fewer people in Europe. This was caused by many factors, not ultimately the Black Death that had obviously wiped out even owners as a class in a way, and so the surviving owners kind of took advantage of that, and fitting this into a broader picture of how essentially the Middle Ages were until that point had been, at least until that point, a more dynamic system than one that eventually formed during the late Middle Ages, the early modern era, and that characterized European society until the great revolutions of the late modern modern era, at least in part, because obviously when we talk about land ownings, we're not just making it strictly political and social matter. There were certain technicalities and economical dynamics that really come into play in following centuries, especially considering that the countrysides in Europe during the modern age are increasingly detached from the city economy, to which they were obviously still strictly tied, but the cities at that time were becoming part of a broader net of international trade, and even obviously the colonialism and the opening of the access to the Europeans of new resources and scattered all over the globe eventually started to create a market economy that at a certain point was kind of not anymore in touch with or not so strongly in touch with the agricultural world, unless in the measure it had been during previously during essentially pre-industrial times, because that's also a moment a greatly important moment for the changing of these events. So what happened basically was in turn the development of a class of owners that incidentally became in fact kind of the opposers of the Enlightened revolutions, etc. Because these were the guys who owned the large estates in latifundia that are so characteristic of many areas of Europe during the modern age, and even the contemporary one up to a certain point, that basically had a very telling the truth, they had some economical potential, of course, because it was a lot of land, but they gave in quantitative terms for relatively to the single owner so much wealth that the owner at a certain point, not having competitors in the social condition, because basically all the land belonged to the nobility and therefore to these people who ruled it all, and relative rural communities, they wouldn't invest into it in new technologies, in new investments for having a higher profit. This is kind of structuralist interpretation that can be obviously argued, but generally speaking, this is the case. If you have smaller middle owners, probably if we talk about the same amount of land, there will be much more growth and innovation into those fragmented lands than into the big ones, the latifundia, etc. Although there must be also another factor that has to be considered in here that maybe you can't see from the Middle Ages, is that where there was a time in which the majority of land owning was in the hands of freemen that were therefore kind of middle class, and a higher authority had more problems. So in that sense, it's also very important what the state or who is in charge works with this land, because you can still have very large estates and not a big and not a powerful middle class that can create problems politically speaking to the nobility. But you can still invest as a state, as a bigger guy at the top, on these properties. Think about what started happening, in fact, during the age of colonialism. Think about, for instance, the same British unification at the point. The United Kingdom was formed, or at least was, in the time in which it was, because incidentally, it was the same moment in which the Scots, which were annexed to England, basically, or practically, from a political point of view in the Union, had lost a huge quantity of money because they had invested all their land property on overseas expeditions that basically failed, and not even for the English fault, telling the truth. And eventually, they they kind of were so poor, so indebted that they couldn't even grow as a state and were absorbed by into the United Kingdom proper as it was formed. So that's just an example, but there are other examples of how instead, even if in a very kind of complex and intricate way, considering the policy of those times, the land properties were actually successfully used as property of investment by higher sovereigns. And this starts happening, in fact, especially during the 18th century, in which the state begins to expand, maybe not acquiring the actual land, but trying to allocating all those rights that were proper of the nobility on that land up to that point. And to tell you the truth, really obstacled the formation of a capitalist and liberalist economy. And the failure of certain states in the European history to make it as great powers into the contemporary era, not surprisingly, had been had occurred because of the resistance of the nobility, who absolutely didn't want to share power with a more centralized state, wanted to continue living of the local privileges and duties, excise duties, and other local, impediments to a freer economy. And that incidentally made, in a certain sense, the world state, let's say, fail in many ways. Think about the Polish-Lithuanian Confederacy in the 18th century that gets literally eaten up alive by Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Think about the kingdom of Sicily, that in the 18th century was quite of a reasonable power, but basically it's the same time in which enlightened reforms fail. And in the 19th century it's a very weak state. So kind of say that there are certain dynamics that can be tracked, even at such an early stage of landholding development and and the evolution of agricultural techniques like in delayed Middle Ages. And the question at this point, it's better to start from the end, in the sense, where were there in Europe more dynamic systems of landholding and agricultural production. Well, indeed, we have to look especially at Tuscany. I was saying, generally speaking, Southern Europe and or Italy, but I think Tuscany is probably the brightest example of what it means. Sharecropping. And sharecropping, as you know, it's at the base of it's a form of of land working and organization that starts more from the bottom than in an estate, in a latifundia, etc. A latifundium. In the sense that there are certain middle class owners who entrust the land to certain peasants, what will be seen right now. But I would like to concentrate more at this point on the geographical location, because Tuscany, why Tuscany first of all? Well, Tuscany had during the low Middle Ages a story in which that made it very special in many ways, because it was an area that saw a relatively weak centralized government. Florence was raising as a sort of a regional state, but actually had a very weak strength from a coercive point of view, which means that Florence at a point was like literally the especially before the Black Death, the wealthiest city in the whole world. It had an income that surpassed the one of the Kingdom of England as a whole. At the same time, it's a paradox. It didn't have a corresponding political and military power, for which basically was defeated by all its neighbors, but it was so resourceful, economically speaking, that kept growing, and its expansion in this sense grew increasingly mindful of its intrinsic weakness in a way, and kind of extended more in an economical way, through an economical penetration than an actually iron fist through the military occupation of expansion that tended to curb the local political autonomies in Tuscany. So obviously, at the beginning of the modern age, the Grand Duchy of Tuscany is formed. So there is this kind of regional state indeed. But Florence, and that was the capital and the leading city. So when you say Florence, it's basically the same the same Grand Duchy of Tuscany in itself by approximation. Kind of maintained this kind of republican idea of freedoms, of the general idea that citizens were freer, because indeed those were regions that through the 13th and 14th century had grown quite fast in their middle classes. So the middle class at a point in Florence is even capable of kicking out nobles to establish this kind of democracy called republicanism that was always an oligarchy, telling the truth, as always, by the way, in the Ancien Regime. But it kind of was very proud of this idea that, it was a general freedom compared to the northern Italian lordships that were much more centralized and vertical as dominations. And that incidentally, however, formed much more efficient and powerful states. And Florentine and Tuscan weaknesses from the point of view had also an effect on land owning, because if there is no lord and there is no one who can create something that resembles at least sort of centralized government, it's obvious that the average people will tend to have more freedom and to organize more spontaneously from an economical point of view. Tuscany was this kind of patchwork. It was a sort of confederacy, than a Florentine confederacy rather than a Florentine state proper, or Tuscan state proper, and it kind of maintained these relatively liberal ideas. It's not surprising, for instance, that Tuscany was so important during the Enlightenment, and the Habsburgs managed to basically make it the most advanced country in the world for things like death penalties and freeing from the church influence, etc. Because the Tuscans already had this tradition of liberalism. Obviously, it's something that makes laugh us today to call it such, because for our modern perspective, that would have been still a very oppressive place to live. But for those times it wasn't, and this is something that has its roots straight into the low Middle Ages, not even the late one. During the late one, telling truth, also Tuscany from the previous centuries had a kind of of acceleration of social stratification and social crystallization, but for late medieval standards, and was still the most advanced place from this point of view, probably, that you could find, at least relatively to the development of sharecropping. Now, there are areas in Europe that, and therefore on the agricultural level, now there are areas in Europe that kind of can compare, always in a pale way when it comes to to certain things that Italy did. That, however, is not surprisingly still in southern Europe and in two regions, or one region overall, that is actually quite close, was actually quite relatively close for those times to central and northern Italy, that were Provence and Aquitaine, so the Occitan region, essentially. Southern France and central and northern Italy always share a great similarities, especially in the development of at a very age in development of the communal system. Then eventually the southern France was conquered by or better reacquired in a certain quite euphemistically by the French kings of the north, that instead were the most feudalized stratified thing you could find in Europe in that sense. And the development of the southern French communities was kind of stamped by the exportation of feudalism into those lands. There was feudalism there too, but it was something much weaker. The middle property was more developed, just like in Italy, and we can say that even in the late Middle Ages, Provence and Aquitaine resemble in certain things the Italian situation, and they saw, incidentally, the development of sharecropping as well, as in Tuscany and other regions of Italy. Tuscany became kind of model. Eventually, it was exported successfully in the greatest part of central and northern Italy. In many ways, in south, instead, the latifundia kind of crystallized at that point. But in fact, this society was quite different from north to south. And obviously, we don't have to think of sharecropping as a very, gentle and liberal thing to do. We're still thinking about a time which rights were people who were serfs, who lived in quite dire conditions. So what we have is this kind of middle class of commoners, of bourgeois, who basically tried during the low and late Middle Ages to acquire agricultural lands to be worked by certain locators that they were essentially peasants. They were through these contracts, however, under very heavy, conditions. So we don't have to, picture it as something so tender compared to the latifundia, etc. But it had the, even these dire conditions of the peasants working in there show you how, the middle class that owned that land was anxious to make the most of those from those lands in economical terms, something that the greater owners really didn't much. Also because at that time they were also inserted in other circuits, in other nets that um, could allow them to find new, kind of new incomes, especially deriving from political and military affairs, acquaintances, role, in courts, etc. And there is a clash in this sense between the commoners and the nobility in Tuscany to achieve something like that. And in general, however, and this is where we get back on track, talking about the general conditions of the European um, landed property, we have to think that the majority of European rural populations at that time were were framed in a more or less, rigid way within certain land lordships that could be either lay or ecclesiastical, depending, and couldn't basically escape from there. So the the kind of mobility that you can find in areas like Tuscany and the rest and part of Italy, and other southern regions of France was kind of an exception, was kind of an anomaly compared to the normal conditions in which the peasantry lived all over Europe. And it's not surprising, by the way, to think that Tuscany at this time is the cradle of humanism and the Renaissance. So it's probably not so impressive. It's not so surprising to think that from a from a place in which, from a region of Europe in which there was generally more free capitals, more investments for the middle class, that more talents could, have resources to invest in order to carry out their businesses, and why, Tuscany was the land of such famous and first order artists like painters, architects, sculptors, etc. Obviously, there is also great role of the courts, of the fact that the Medici at that time in Florence were hugely wealthy, so they could obviously finance great works, um, and to make these artists work. But one thing is to have, already a middle class that can provide those skilled artists. Another thing is living in a completely rural, and highly feudalized and fully urbanized area of Central or Eastern Europe, in which, the few people, that can dedicate to tertiary activities are quite scanty and probably not even well, not probably enormously talented. Obviously, this is a bit of an approximation, but it's pretty much obvious in the bigger picture that the Renaissance emerged from regions like Tuscany and not by regions like, I don't know, I don't want to say any country that can be offended by this term, but it's evident that, the Renaissance started from there. And that's also, one element. I'm not saying the Renaissance was born because of that. It was just a factor that definitely strongly influenced, and Tuscan artists were literally all over Europe at that time, in part for the wealth distribution of the Tuscan lands in itself. So However, we have to think that going back once again to the rest of Europe, that between the 14th and 15th century, the landlordships we talked about, so those against the commoners kind of struggle to gain more autonomy, etc., were at a certain in turn framed within superior powers that operated on a territorial dimension, um, which is basically what I said before. That is, certain high nobility was, engaged into political and military affairs that were part of broader territorial constructions from which they could eventually benefit. And we're talking about a period in time in which expenses were so high for war, and technological innovation was relatively weak, that sometimes it was better to wage war in order to obtain income rather than thinking about creating something new that you wouldn't even know what it would be, and for which you neither had the resources to research for. That's the reason why most of early medieval history was, and most arguably also the rest of the Middle Ages was based on a raiding economy. It's especially in certain lands of Europe, not because it was a cultural thing as a cause, but it's simply because the local potential in terms of resources and technological advancements in production was so low that it wasn't even worth, economically speaking, to invest into it to receive benefits that you could instead achieve through war. So when we talk about the clash between commoners and nobility, especially looking from the perspective of the end of the Ancien regime and the French Revolution, etc. As moderns, we should, however, understand had been um, that feudalism had been a system that had been born for strictly functional reasons, and the reasons were why it came into exist, into structure, was that at least the conditions were favorable. Then maybe feudalism might have not spread in a certain fashion if, I don't know, the if Gaul in the migration era had a different story and the Carolingians hadn't come out with that specific system. But generally speaking, we can't be so political and ideological to say that system was bad because it was based on oppression at that time, and today we're better because we have rights. Yeah, okay, but today we have rights because there were certain social and economical conditions that brought people to fight for their rights. In those times, there was nothing like that, and in part, feudalism was born even as an oppressive system, exactly for paradoxically, um, first of all, defending the life of someone, and then hoping that that life could be good in economical terms. So when even during this time of late medieval and early modern history, we look at these aristocracies that to us seem grotesque or self-absorbed into their self-aggrandizement, etc. We are looking about a clientelary society like the feudal one was, that actually was meant to work like that. And in the clientelary system, the success of a certain lord also equated, in relative terms, to the success of the masses that worked for him, because that was really the system of how things worked at the time. And this slight evolution that began to occur is, as we've seen with Tuscany, related to progressed to previous conditions that had made it possible in many ways, and that had all the kind of superstructural effects that we can admire with the Renaissance and humanism and so on. And and at the top of this system obviously was always a royal or princely power that basically worked to protect the whole social hierarchy, not just from external threats like, in fact, enemies, invasions, etc., but trying to prevent the same social hierarchy to remain the way it was. Because obviously, even if we said, yeah, that peasants were at this time were oppressed because, they kind of they didn't have the resources, and it was easy to oppress them, to keep them down for strictly sheer strengths deriving from an unequal distribution of resources. We're talking about a social system that could theoretically be reversed. I mean, think about the revolt of the peasantry in the 16 during the reform in 16th century Germany. It were pretty big things, and we will come back about this in afterwards. But for saying that, technically speaking, there were still these were kind of crystallized systems because there was an active force that kept it crystallized socially, and not because it theoretically, peasants couldn't revolt and burn everything down and retake what they thought was theirs. Obviously, things are a bit more complicated, but I think it's very important in history to give this dimension of constant instability of social dynamics that eventually bring to the major bring to determined major historical events themselves. Um, and the social hierarchy was in this sense being preserved with the sword, of course, and the resources that could provide you with that sword. That was the wealth distribution that happened at that time. But there were also more idealistic, resources that also had obviously their actual impact in the system, like the juridical ones. This is the moment in Europe in which monarchic ideals start to get strengthened and corroborated and backed by essentially ideologists like scholars, people that were paid by kings, in fact, to stress the royal prerogatives, and even on the social stance, because at this point, yeah, the kings weren't really much loved. The nobility always sought to kind of, expand its own power at the expense of the crown, and the crown in turn always tried to keep in check the nobles. This is the moment in which the so-called modern state gets formed, essentially to try to give a more centralized asset to the system, a center that had itself, into the king, and that was seemingly also brutally accelerated by the evolution in warfare, especially the spreading of firearms and the need to produce them en masse, which couldn't be done just by artisans, but it had maybe needed statal production, which needed an efficient fiscal system, which needed contribution from society, which needed bureaucracy, etc. So this is the moment in which you can understand the infinite really levels at which on which these societies were functioning, including the social spectrum and the social corporations themselves. But there were also more, aside from rights, that obviously was something very delicate because it more with ideological speculation. It had mostly to do with the fact that there were from this feudal Europe that was emerging, still traditions that couldn't be obstacled. First of all, the one that the king was a king because people had put him in charge to to preserve the pre-existing rights of the local communities. And this is also another very big topic, but at this point it's also important to look at the kind of ideological equilibrisms that philosophers and political thinkers could think of in order to stress, the advancement in the royal prerogatives. So this idea of the king as a sort of peacekeeper, at least within the obviously the royaume borders. The idea that there was a higher order, that God had entrusted the monarch with a particular right, that even put him in connection with God. There is also a lot of religious and theological debate about this, because at a certain point also another problem had been the kind of something that went on from literally from the struggle in investitures, whether the kings had to be subjected to papal to popes in juridical in political matters, or vice versa. Think about I don't know, the supremacy of Supremacy Act of the, or better, the two acts, the ones of Henry VIII and the one of his daughter Elizabeth, eventually in the second half of the 16th century, that kind of stressed the fact that the king was also chief of the church. So, and all things were done essentially to get more money, so to try to feed the monarchy, the state, with something that for which at a certain point during the modern age, the church, the ecclesiastical resources to sack were over, essentially, and this eventually forced to the actual building of a truly centralized system, or at least for the preparation to it, up to the Code de Napoleon, that identified the state as the only juridical source of law. So all things that who has studied history of law knows during these times. But a general tendency, however, as I was saying also before, was the kind of crystallization of the social hierarchy, in the sense that keeping social hierarchy idling was a good way to control it better, to make it less synetic, to make it less to make all the various social classes less capable of exiting their own condition, while theoretically the monarchy could and should have surpassed them in a way. The English monarchy didn't make it at a point, other monarchies did it, but generally speaking, there's a progressive crystallization of all the political and social bodies in during this time, and the progressive exclusion through absolutism of the major political autonomy that all these various corporations, this is the term that comes into my mind, had enjoyed previously, since the Middle Ages. So at this point, and we have to think that the whole thing reflected itself at the bottom of this hierarchy, to the physical soil in many ways, to the greatest part of the population, that was the mass of peasants at that time, to work the land and granted the first economical base for every power of that time. So what were actually the consequences of this crystallization in the relation between the local lords and the rustics? Well, we have to say that remaining strictly in the Middle Ages, because this video is meant about the Middle Ages, kind of swept towards the modern age. But during the Middle Ages, this system actually didn't always hold. And the more we go back in time, and the more we realize how it didn't work. So eventually, you understand that crystallization eventually made it to kind of curb the peasants' autonomy, but this came to the costs sometimes of very heavy efforts and very bloody results. And the social conflicts in general as a whole, besides the peasantry, but were something always quite big, especially in times into which the kingdoms and states were, in crisis. Think about great wars that were fought at these times. The regular problem was that there wasn't enough money, and the kings didn't have enough money to keep the war going on, because they literally didn't. They were already very indebted. Nobody credited them anymore. They couldn't pay the troops, and the troops would mutiny, and it would kind of make a mess into the whole country, which would increase social, economical crisis and so on. So the best way that the monarchs had at that time to get money was to call, um, representatives of the various social classes. Think about in the Kingdom of France, most famously the État Général, that means the general states, so to raise money, which was something that displeased them all, because obviously nobody wanted to pay. At a certain point, the metus hostilis, so this incumbent threat of the enemy that could invade the country and create problems. The Hundred Years' War is a pretty good example, but there are countless at this time. We're kind of prefer to pay instead than, if not paying it to another sovereign, at least not to suffer the problems deriving from the social collapse of their own country that could put an end even to their ambition and the same availability of resources at a point. And however, social agitations were all over the place, and for the political and social asset at the times, as well for the technological level, the coercion of these unruly classes was pretty low. Revolts were something extremely difficult to curb into the Middle Ages. One thing is to be, I don't know, in the 19th century, having an extremely advanced weapon technology, managing to shoot with a musket a mass of unarmed peasants is one thing. Doing it with your sword is something a bit different, and we can't say that until the late Middle Ages, peasant revolts were something extremely frequent, extremely dangerous, and especially extremely extended, even from a sheer geographical point of view. If you look at the Jacquerie in France, that in fact occurred because of many problems were occurring during the especially after the defeat of the French army and the capture of the king John, famously at the Battle of Poitiers in the 1356. It's as if the social structure was collapsing, and peasants began to literally invade, the nobles' lands and raising castles through the ground. I mean, it was a pretty substantial force to be reckoned with. This is something that happened with the collapse of the French state equally in 1789, and all for the same reasons, because the peasants had a very few things, and one very good advice you can get in every time in history is never to put someone in a condition of having nothing to lose. Now, these people lived in such dire conditions that when famines broke out and there was nothing really to eat, it was like just decision between taking your you know um, your your pitchfork and going robbing the nobles, becoming a brigand, or making a mass revolt, or literally starving to death, and not just you, but also your whole family. So it was something pretty sad, pretty brutal in many ways, and fortunately, we live, at least I live, and I think the majority of my audience lives in places where these things do not exist anymore. But this is the this is being think about World War II. Surely we'll have grandparents and remember at a certain point the absence of food at a point in these great catastrophes that happened. Well, in the Middle Ages, this tended to happen much more frequently simply because people were much poorer. So it was much easier, were much more exposed to the environment, to natural forces, and when something went wrong, not just, the actual places could be destroyed, but also the whole, social and economical systems could literally crumble. So these violent and brutal and bloody consequences were kind of natural in many ways. Um, the um, and therefore what I was saying is that the the kings in the low and late Middle Ages kind of had relatively few chances too, in the sense that yeah, peasants might revolt at that point, but it's not because they were um, greedy, monarchs who wanted just to leave, like in cartoons, into making baths in their own gold coins and stuff like that, and living in luxury for just for the sake of it on the back of the poor peasants who worked. The situation has always been much more complex, and those monarchs themselves were in a desperate situation of having the fate of whole kingdoms that were not their own personal power, but also groups of, proto-national communities that kind of had felt something in common, that had certain particular interests that were kind of, they kind of benefited from the unity of the kingdom. And in a tragedy like a war, of a defeat, of very dark hours, what could you do as a king if not, in this sense, increasing taxes or making pressures on, on the social classes? I mean, that was literally the only way to survive as a political community, if anything. So this is why how we explain into Europe these extremely frequent at a point, especially in the 14th century, but also in the 15th, of seemingly sudden, extremely violent, and greatly dreaded peasant revolts. And it seems, and there's also um, a point that maybe I will answer in another video, is how really violent were peasant revolts during the late medieval and early modern era compared to, let's just say, the previous centuries. Do we have historically any evidence of this? And it's very difficult because you have to think that documentation is greatly lacking at a point. So, had it always been there, or the growth of the European economy and all the problems that eventually occurred with Black Death and all the political and social changes kind of accelerated and inflated these revolts, and also, in terms of sheer numbers of participants, because if you think about the Jacquerie in France, it's like, the greater, it actually were several revolts on their own, and they kind of remembered something, unprecedented. in many ways. So, and especially that kind of encompass a territory that seemingly at the beginning, in the previous centuries had not been there. My opinion is that probably you have to look actually at the economical circuits and trade nets, because when you have relatively simpler society in which um, you kind of produce and consume the same things. So essentially, the food comes straight from your land into your table. You're kind of responsible. You're not part of a broader system. Obviously, this is a theoretical example because there's always been a market. There's always been interaction of goods, etc. But the point is that when you start depending, like it became to happen in the late Middle Ages, on an international trade that is always more extended geographically speaking, and when you have certain regions that maybe are, from one side to the other of Europe, like, I don't know, Russia and England, that at this time become to, Russia starts to export a lot of grain towards Western Europe at the point. Well, if something messy happens in Russia, and there is a famine, or at least grain can't be exported anymore, you're gonna have revolts in Portugal, because essentially there's not enough food to support what it had previously been possible to do. So the obvious consequence is that the greater this system is, and the greater the effects are, in many ways. So um, obviously there are disasters at this point. Think about the Great Famine in 1315 and 17, or the same Black Death, for which this is such a huge crisis that sometimes is caused even by sudden climate changes, natural catastrophes. At that point, you can't say, you know, that kind of, was extended to more areas. But if you have a world system like, I don't know, the French kingdom during the Hundred Years' War, that is a kingdom that at that point has a sort of deep root into the territory and can drain resources, etc. These resources get wiped out because the king is taken prisoner and you have to pay a huge ransom to the English. And maybe there is famine because there are both the French and the English raiding all over France. Uh, at that point, you see that it's a picture that comes from a much greater and more complex system than one of an early medieval Europe, and therefore the consequences are gonna necessarily be more structural. That is, bigger, usually, on certain levels. But I will try to explain this better in another occasion. So for today, I didn't think I had to talk so much, but yeah, it was nice talking about it. I'm not greatly passionate about social history, but I kind of get to talk about it quite frequently over time because I think it can explain a lot objectively. I don't know if you get bored just reading the title of this video, but I think can give some food for thought thinking about such things. So, okay, if you managed to listen to me up to this point, I thank you very heartily. If you like this video, please share it. Otherwise, just leave a like or subscribe to my channel to receive further contents through notification. Like every time I make a video snap, you can't know that. And as always, I thank you for watching as always, and I wish you a beautiful time and see you next time. Bye.